The most talked about subject lately is the return of Jesus. And I know this is a topic that touches the hearts of many people, practically everyone. Some are curious and interested in the subject, others are afraid, others say they don't believe, and others simply avoid thinking about it. But according to scholars of prophecy, and I agree with them, before the return of Christ, the Great Tribulation would have to happen. That is, it doesn't happen imminently. There is a prophetic order, a sequence of events, and not just a Jesus is coming tomorrow without context. If Jesus only comes after the Great Tribulation, then this completely changes the question we need to ask. The question ceases to be when and becomes, where are we in this process? The question I ask you is, has the Great Tribulation already begun? Because if it has already begun, this means that we have already entered a phase that demands another level of discernment, another level of firmness, another level of preparation. Is it already happening now? Is it really happening at this exact moment? Are we merely experiencing the beginning of sorrows, as Jesus describes, or have we already crossed the line that inaugurates the full tribulation? Is what we are experiencing truly this, or are we misinterpreting it, mixing fear with prophecy and confusing the world's crisis with the literal fulfillment of Scripture? Therefore, it is so important for us to feel and perceive what is around us, not with paranoia, not with despair, but with spiritual sobriety. To look attentively at the time we are living in and seek this certainty. Are we in fact in the last moment? Because being vigilant is not being alarmist. Being vigilant is being lucid and prepared. It is not living anesthetized. It is not sleeping spiritually while the scenario changes. The central idea here is precisely this. We are living in a decisive time, and this, for us, is a very serious matter. And when I say serious, I'm talking about eternal decisions, about faithfulness, about truth, about choosing a path, about aligning with God. In your opinion, will Jesus return before or after the Great Tribulation? I want you to participate because this isn't a monologue. It's a topic that divides opinions and needs to be addressed with respect and an open Bible. Leave your comment and I will respond personally. I respect your opinion and it's very important. And I mean this sincerely. I don't want to create a theological argument. I want to raise awareness and lead us to think deeply about this important subject. So let's get down to business, shall we? Now I want you to stay with me because we're going to build this interesting line of reasoning step by step. We are truly in this final moment. And I know many people have heard this phrase so many times that it's lost its impact, isn't that right? But when we look at the whole picture, the scenario, the signs, the acceleration, it starts to gain weight again, and this time a deeper impact. And if we remember the word, the Apostle John, he says, "Little children, it is the last hour." This is no small thing. It's a spiritual declaration. It's as if he was saying, the clock is ticking, time is running out. And when he said this, almost 2,000 years had passed. So what does this mean for us today? It means that if John already called his time the last hour, then we, who are 2,000 years later, need at least to consider the seriousness of what he said. That we are living, so to speak, the last seconds of this spiritual clock, you understand? As if the hand were trembling at its limit. It's as if we're in a tighter, more intense, more decisive final stretch. As if we're on the edge, on the verge of the final events. And this is important. It's not to generate panic. It's to generate clarity, vigilance, and sanctity. The signs are happening everywhere, and that's obvious. And the problem isn't a lack of signs. Often the problem is an excess of distraction. Now, I think it's important for us to understand a distinction that appears here. One thing is the last days, and another is the end of days. Because if we mix the two, we can misinterpret everything, you understand? Or simply anticipate conclusions without basis. And is there a difference? Yes, there is a difference. And this difference, in the reasoning of the text, helps to separate a prolonged period of the final stretch from the definitive closing of the cycle. If I'm not mistaken, the speech attempts to separate these concepts with Hebrew terms, Acharit Hayamim, the last days, and Ketz Hayamim, the end of days. And this detail alone shows that the conversation is not just emotional, it is trying to be technical, biblical, conceptual. That is, it's not just an idea of the final stretch, it's as if it were the complete closing of a cycle, as if history were reaching the point where events not only approach but begin to unfold with an inevitable character, like a door that has already been opened and will never close again. So in fact, we are in that final moment. And I'm not saying this to create sensationalism, nor to generate fear. I'm saying this because when we look at the scriptures seriously and at the world soberly, the feeling is that the spiritual clock is really pressing harder, And I've brought here, once again, all those references that we showed in the previous video. You can watch it later because it's very interesting. And if you haven't watched it yet, watch it later, because there we build the foundation and here we delve deeper. References that point both to the events called the beginning of sorrows and to the Great Tribulation. That is, there are texts that describe an initial phase, a beginning of contractions, and there are texts that describe an intensified, heavier, more decisive phase. We find this in the prophets of the New Testament and also in the book of Revelation. And when you put the two things together, the teachings of Jesus, the apostolic letters, and Revelation, you realize that the theme isn't peripheral, it's central to the expectations of God's people. And I repeat these references precisely for a reason. They address the same theme, converge on the same point as if they were drawing our attention in the same direction, as if several signs on different roads pointed to the same city. Do you understand? Okay, but now we're going to gradually get to know each other better and talk about something very direct. Now we're moving away from the general atmosphere and into the criteria. Because it's one thing to feel that time is running out. It's another thing to know, biblically, what characterizes each phase. How can we recognize that we are already at the end, not only by feeling, but by concrete signs consistent with the Word? How can we know that we are in the Great Tribulation? Because that's the question that changes everything. If it's just the beginning of sorrows, the posture is one thing. If it's already the Great Tribulation, the posture is another. How do we identify the beginning of Tzarah Gdolah, the Great Tribulation? And I like that the text uses a specific term because it gives precision. It's not tribulation in the generic sense of life's problems. It's a specific eschatological period. Has it already begun? Have we already crossed the line? Has there already been a milestone that inaugurates this phase? And here I draw our attention to something. We need to truly apply our spiritual perspective to what is happening in the world. Because without spiritual vision, we look and only see headlines. With spiritual vision, we begin to perceive patterns, directions, and also deceptions. Because, I repeat, we cannot be alienated. Alienated here means living on autopilot, entertained, distracted, without discernment, as if nothing were happening. We cannot remain as if we are asleep in the face of what is happening. Because Jesus spoke about watching, Paul spoke about being sober, and Revelation speaks of those who have ears to hear. Of course, we are not going to live in despair, as if the world were about to collapse on our heads at any moment, because despair is not faith, and panic is not discernment. But as men and women of God, with the Spirit of God within us, we need to have a more complete vision of the scenario, a vision that unites the Bible and reality, prayer and understanding, the Word and discernment, especially because we need spiritual weapons to combat the spiritual attacks of the last days, which are very specific attacks. And when I say specific, I'm talking about sophisticated deception, pressure on faith, seductions, distractions, a cooling of love, false teachings, confusion, things that cannot be combated with opinion, but with a life with God and firmness in the Word. And that's precisely why it's so important for us to know, what is the event, what is the sign, what exactly do we need to see to say with certainty, the Great Tribulation has begun, now there's no more doubt. Because if we don't define this, we become hostage to rumors, sensationalist videos, fear and interpretations thrown to the wind. In other words, when does it stop being just the beginning of sorrows and become in fact the Great Tribulation? What is the turning point? What is the landmark? What is the prophetic trigger that separates one phase from the other? What do we need to observe? What cannot be missing? What needs to happen clearly and publicly? What will indicate to us that we have already entered this period? Because when we understand this, we stop living confused and start living prepared. And that is the objective of the video, to prepare, not to frighten. When we look at this information within the scriptures, and I mean within the scriptures, not based on mere opinion, the conversation changes level. Because here we move from the realm of opinion to the realm of criteria. We move from "I feel" to what is written. Because it's one thing to say "I think," in my opinion, "I believe." And yes, of course, we can all have opinions, that's normal. And opinion is human, it's legitimate, it's part of life. But opinion doesn't sustain anyone when time is running out, when deception grows, and when pressure increases. But the most important point is, what do the scriptures tell us? Because it is scripture that corrects our emotions, that adjusts our lens, and that gives us parameters to discern times and seasons. What are the signs they give us so that we can recognize? Now, yes, now is truly Great Tribulation, or at least the event that involves and inaugurates this time. In other words, it's not about guessing dates, it's about recognizing milestones. It's not about sensationalism, it's about understanding and preparation. So this is what we want to share at this moment. We want to build a line of reasoning that is biblical, coherent, and responsible, so that you are not swayed by any wind, any rumor, any alarmist headline. The beginning of the Great Tribulation will specifically involve Israel, my dear friends. And I'll warn you now, this is the kind of subject that many people avoid because it deals with geopolitics, beliefs, conflicts, and narratives. But if it's in the Bible, we can't simply ignore it. I think it's pointless to try to run away from this topic. It's pointless to skirt around it, change the subject, or try to push it aside. There's no escaping it, nowhere to run. Because in the prophetic framework, Israel doesn't appear as a detail. It appears as the axis. The Great Tribulation involves Israel because, if I'm not mistaken, that's the axis of the matter. It's like the center of gravity of the topic. The events of the end times are deeply intertwined with the people of Israel, intertwined in such a way that when you pull one end, you find the other. Prophets, alliances, Jerusalem, the temple, nations, conflicts, everything comes back there. And we're not just talking about the Jewish people scattered throughout the world, but the nation of Israel. Because there is a difference between a people and a state, between identity and territory, between dispersion and an established nation. It will be at the heart of the problem, at the heart of the tension, at the heart of the decisions, at the heart of international pressures. Therefore, there is no Great Tribulation without us looking at Israel. If you take Israel out of the equation, you dismantle the map of the end times. At least within this line of interpretation, you can't identify this period from another angle, as if it was something disconnected from it. You can observe global effects, yes. But the pivot of the event, according to the text, points to Israel. But the Great Tribulation will bring climatic effects to the world. Yes, absolutely correct. The entire world will be impacted, because judgment, upheaval, and collapse are not contained within one region. World geopolitics will change. Perfectly true as well. Because when Israel comes into focus, inevitably the alliances, rivalries, and interests of nations shift. It will involve all nations. It's not a local event, it's a global scenario. We will see astronomical events, changes, occurrences of various kinds. However, according to this line of reasoning, everything involves Israel. As if Israel were the clock, and the world were the system reacting to the movement of that clock. Everything revolves around Israel, the nation of Israel, I mean, not just the Jewish people themselves, but the state, the territory. What is there on the map and at the center of tensions, you know? Because that's where historical, religious, and strategic interests converge, and that's where many prophecies point as the stage for final decisions. And when we look at Israel's position, even geographically, it's striking. Even those who don't believe in prophecy recognize that it's a key region of the planet. It's a nation surrounded by predominantly Muslim countries and situated in a very strategic way. And that's not an opinion, that's a map. To the bottom, Africa, to one side, Asia, to the top, Europe. It's like a bridge, a corridor, a point of passage and influence. In a way, Israel is there as a point in the middle of routes and continents. They are literally in the center. and this helps to understand why any movement there reverberates throughout the world. So we can understand why geopolitically Israel is so relevant to the nations of the world, because Israel is not just a small nation in territory, it's a great nation in significance, impact, and global attention. And of course, many people are thirsty for that land because of that as well. Because when a region is strategic, it attracts interest, it attracts dispute, it attracts covetousness, it attracts international pressure. And this happens at the political, economic, and military levels. But the main argument here isn't just political, it's about spirituality. Because in the biblical narrative, Israel is not just a territory, it's a symbol, it's a covenant, it's a spiritual story that spans millennia. There is a spiritual cause that involves the land of Israel and what it represents. And that's why the topic resonates so much. It's not just geography, it's meaning. It's not just a map, it's prophecy. Israel will be at the center of the Great Tribulation, I'm sure of it. Just look at the biblical prophecies. Because when you go through the prophets, when you read Daniel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, and when you compare them with Revelation, Israel appears repeatedly as a setting, as a target, as a reference point. So, I think we can't look the other way. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We need to observe the nation of Israel because it functions as God's clock for events. It signals, it points, it gives indications of what is to come. As if God had placed a visible marker of history there, a point of reference for those who want to discern times and seasons. And that's why so much converges on this theme. And here's something considered very important. Based on the words of the prophet Daniel, we see mention of a world leader, a leader connected to the nations. In other words, it wouldn't just be a local ruler, not a king of a small country. It would be someone with global reach, international influence, the ability to forge alliances and move structures. And this, according to this reading, harmonizes with the book of Revelation, which speaks of beasts. And here's the point. Daniel speaks of kingdoms and a character who rises up. Revelation describes symbolic figures representing power, dominion, and opposition to God. So, the reading attempts to put the pieces together. It's a matter of biblical interpretation, of textual harmony, of prophetic harmony. That is to say, it's the attempt to place scripture with scripture, prophet with prophet, book with book, to see if there is coherence in the overall picture. And I think it's important to remember that on this point, many theologians, both Christian and Jewish, in this case Messianic Jews, end up agreeing in general terms. Not necessarily on every detail, but on the central idea that there will be a time of oppression and a leader who will pressure Israel. Because, if I'm not mistaken, Jews who don't believe in Yeshua won't connect Daniel with Revelation in the same way, since they don't make that connection with the Christian text. This is an honest distinction. They are different canons, different readings, different traditions. But even so, many recognize the expectation, within the theme of the last days, that there will be a world leader who will oppress Israel. And this point, even without Revelation, appears as an eschatological expectation in various readings. A time of hardship, a time of anguish, a time of pressure on Israel. This is treated as a fact within this interpretation. So, we see this consensus. The world leader mentioned by Daniel and the one described in Revelation would be the same person. As if Daniel described the skeleton of the event, and Revelation gave colors, images, and symbolic details of the same scenario. And what do we call him then? Anti-Mashiach, that is, the Antichrist. The false anointed one, the false Messiah, the one who imitates to deceive, the one who promises solutions to capture worship and submission. And what would be the greatest sign, the main mark that the Great Tribulation has begun? What we call peace agreements. And this is very significant, because in prophetic interpretation, the Great Deception often comes packaged as peace. It comes with beautiful speeches, with promises of stability, with the appearance of a solution. And here's an important detail. It wouldn't just be with the nations of the world in general, but especially with the Arab world. Because that's where the history of direct tension lies. That's where the most sensitive geopolitical and religious knot is. Why? Because history shows Israel in conflict with the Arab world, or more accurately, often the Arab world in conflict with Israel. And when we say this, it's not to oversimplify, but to acknowledge a historical pattern of hostility, wars, territorial and ideological disputes. The argument is that Israel has always sought peace with the surrounding peoples, but regrettably, influences such as radical Islam have fueled a destructive stance against Israel. And here the text is pointing to an ideological force that transforms political conflict into religious conflict, and this hardens the possibility of peace. On many occasions, surrounding Arab nations have attempted the destruction of the State of Israel. And this makes a peace agreement, not a diplomatic detail. It is a huge historical event that can carry prophetic weight because it would be something that always seemed impossible. And then we remember several scenarios. Because when we say Arab world, it seems like an abstract thing. But in practice, it translates into real fronts, real borders, real conflicts, decades of accumulated tension. The issue of Lebanon, the issue of Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And each of these nations carries a specific history with Israel, each with its wars, its agreements, its wounds, its alliances, and its internal pressures. Until within this narrative, God, by His grace, gave Israel victories in significant and terrifying conflicts that for many people seemed impossible to overcome and which left deep marks on the memory of the Middle East and the world. And these nations ended up finding themselves without many alternatives. Let's make peace with Israel. Or at least, let's stop directly fighting and establish a kind of diplomatic coexistence, because the cost of maintaining open hostility becomes too high. Egypt, for example, signed a peace agreement with Israel a long time ago. Jordan, too. In other words, there are precedents. It's not a theory. It has already happened. Syria has always been polarized, especially regarding the Golan Heights issue, if I'm not mistaken. And this Golan issue acts as an open wound, a sensitive point, a zone of dispute that keeps the climate of tension always ready to reignite. Lebanon, on the other hand, has had moments of relative peace, but it hasn't consolidated a definitive agreement, hasn't signed a final treaty, a formal recognition of peace, and here we have Hezbollah as an impediment. Because there comes an element that is not just state against state. It's an armed group, a parallel force, a structure that influences internal politics and maintains active hostility. And beyond the countries that are right next door, we also have other names that enter this picture. Morocco, Sudan, Libya, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and other Muslim-majority countries. In other words, the conversation expands because it's not just immediate neighbors. It's a broader belt of diplomatic, economic, and religious relations that affects the Middle East as a whole. And when these countries move, the whole world feels it. So, the peace agreement with the Arab world would be, my dear friends, one of the strongest signs. Because within this prophetic reasoning, peace wouldn't simply come as a spontaneous gesture. It would come as a historical event, something that reconfigures alliances and creates a new environment, albeit a temporary one. And then comes the question, what have we seen in these last few days that was in a way alarming? What concrete events have made many people raise an eyebrow and think, wait, this is moving? We have seen real movements in this direction. Movements that previously seemed improbable and suddenly began to enter the public debate, the news, and the negotiating tables. Things moved in this direction, especially with the determination of President Trump at the time to push these agreements forward. And here it is important to note, regardless of political opinion, the fact is that there was a diplomatic push, an active attempt to stitch together normalizations and reposition the chessboard. This generated concern because it gave the impression that we were witnessing the advancement of something like, so there will be peace with the Arab world now. And when we say peace, we need to understand, it could be real peace, it could be partial peace, it could be strategic peace, it could be a paper peace. But the simple movement in that direction is already significant within this interpretation. And within this reasoning, the nation that most represents the Arab world would be Saudi Arabia, and that is why it appears as a central piece in this conversation, because it is not just another country. It carries symbolic, economic, religious, and political weight in the Islamic world and in international relations. And of course, at the heart of this peace agreement with the Arab world the big question that always returns is Palestine, the so-called Palestine. Because that's the knot that never goes away. That's the issue that comes back all the time, as if it were the sticking point of any attempt at stabilization. In other words, this is what we've already shared in another video. This piece of land called Gaza and the other territories, Samaria and Judea, which many call the West Bank, today associated with the idea of Palestine. And here a delicate issue arises, because there are different narratives, different names, historical and political disputes, and therefore the topic is always fraught with controversy. Furthermore, the proposal to create a Palestinian state from these regions is at the heart of the problem, at the center of the discussions, and I think at the heart of the tension between the possibility of peace or war with the Arab world. Because for many, this point defines whether there will be normalization or whether the hostility continues to be fueled. And it was, in practice, through this path that President Trump sought to establish as many peace agreements as possible. It was an attempt to create a regional architecture, to bring countries closer together, reduce formal hostilities, and form a new type of alignment in the Middle East. In a way, he tried to stitch these agreements together, and also in a way, exerted geopolitical pressure to make this happen. And when the pressure increases, many countries begin to assess the cost and benefit, maintaining perpetual conflict or entering into negotiations that bring strategic advantages. And so far we see a kind of peace in the Middle East, even if only apparent. A peace that in many respects seems fragile because it only takes one event, one spark, one local escalation for the climate to change completely. But the most important nation is still missing to complete this picture. Which one is it? Here the text begins to narrow the thesis. What is missing for this to be complete within the prophetic model? We have, for example, Lebanon with a question mark, and this is no coincidence. To this day, Lebanon has not signed an official peace agreement with Israel. Syria hasn't either. In other words, there are still important pieces outside the normalization process. However, Syria maintains a non-war situation with Israel, and at times there is even talk about this possibility, as if there were a controlled tension, unresolved, but also not exploding at every moment. Lebanon, however, remains grappling with the Hezbollah issue, which is allegedly pressuring and influencing the situation to maintain hostility against Israel. In the text, this becomes a direct obstacle, because as long as such a significant factor remains active, the chance of official peace becomes much more difficult. Within this framework, we are observing, even though other Muslim nations exist, these are presented as the main Arab nations involved in the issue. It's as if the prophetic checklist is looking at these key pieces: who has already made peace, who hasn't, and what is still needed to complete the picture. Saudi Arabia, for example, appears as a country that in certain aspects is a partner of the United States and has moments of indirect cooperation with Israel, but has not yet signed an official agreement. And this is crucial to the reasoning, because if it were to enter into an agreement, the symbolic and regional impact would be enormous. And that brings us to a very emblematic point, the famous Abraham Accords, or rather the Abraham Accords as a set of normalizations and treaties. And what does this remind us of? If I'm not mistaken, the text of Daniel 9:27, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." And when you read this phrase with all this in mind, you understand why so many people associate one thing with another: covenant, many, prophetic time, peace. And here we feel there's not much room to maneuver, because the question is, in the world scenario, what exists today that resembles this verse? He will make a covenant with many for 1 week. And note the expression, with many. It's not a simple bilateral agreement. It's something that involves various actors, various nations, various interests, like a broad stitching together. What kind of alliance does someone make with many? Would it only be political interest? Financial? Military? It might even involve all of that, because agreements always involve economics, security, influence, strategic alliances. But the central argument is that it would be an alliance that seeks to bring peace so that the world can breathe and then other interests can be established. As if peace were the gateway to a greater reconfiguration. Control, authority, apparent stability, and a new cycle of power. And within the Middle East, with impacts that also touch Europe and, of course, the entire group of Muslim Arab countries, there is, according to this view, no agreement as significant as the Abraham Accords. And that is why they stand out, because it is not just another treaty, it is a normalization movement that stirs the imagination and the regional landscape. So yes, I also understand why within this interpretation many say, I don't see it any other way. Because to date, it is the event that most closely resembles the described format. Many. Alliance. Peace. Israel. Global impact. What are the Abraham Accords? For those unfamiliar with the term, it's important to understand the basics of the concept before drawing conclusions. These are agreements with Arab Muslim countries that, in a way, seek to do what? Bring peace to the Middle East, or at least establish diplomatic normalization, cooperation, and a new standard of relationship, because peace, in practice, often begins with recognition, dialogue, and agreements that reduce hostilities. And bringing peace to the Middle East has repercussions throughout the world, because the Middle East is not a corner of the map. It's a region that influences energy, the economy, military alliances, and global stability. And we understand why this involves Israel. You can't talk about the Great Tribulation without talking about Israel. You can't talk about the coming of the Lord without talking about Israel as a nation. In prophetic interpretations, Israel is not the periphery, it's the center. In this narrative, it appears as the center of everything. And that's why this subject always comes back, because Israel is the thread that runs through the entire discussion. So, one way to identify that now, yes, would be through these signed agreements. As if the world were entering a phase of breathing, a diplomatic window, an attempt at stabilization. And then the text asks, would this be the prophetic milestone? And then comes the question, which agreements have been signed? Who has already joined? Who hasn't yet? What is missing to complete the picture? With several nations, as shown in this chart, but Lebanon is still missing, Syria is still missing from these agreements, and Saudi Arabia is still missing. And this is where the thesis gains strength, because if the verse speaks of many, then the idea is of breadth, of broad adherence, of a connection that seems larger than normal. Therefore, I say, we would be on the verge. On the verge means we are close to the format, we are close to the scenario, but we haven't yet crossed the finish line. Has it happened completely? Not yet. So I think it's difficult to say, categorically and with absolute certainty, that the Great Tribulation has already begun, because there is not yet, in an effective and official way, this agreement with many fully established. That is to say, there are elements that are approaching, there are shadows of the scenario, there are movements in that direction, but there is still no unequivocal landmark that a person looks at and says, that's it, now it's happened. And here's a very important observation, which I think we should carefully consider, because it avoids misreading and wrong expectations. Many people think that the agreement must necessarily have an explicit duration of 7 years, as if it had to appear in black and white, 7 years for the prophecy to come true. But the verse, as it's being read here, doesn't exactly say that. It says that he will make a covenant with many for 1 week. And here's a technical point. Week can be understood as a specific prophetic period, and not necessarily as the contractual duration written in a public document. The agreement could be for 8, 10, 20, but there would be a 7-year period related to the unfolding of events, as if the prophetic clock had 7 years, even though the diplomatic document has a different time frame. In other words, the document we would see on television wouldn't necessarily have 7 years written on it, because international treaties don't always come with the kind of prophetic language we imagine. The logic presented is that the events last 7 years, and the alliance would be formed and in some way would relate to that period, including a break along the way, as many interpret it. And this is important, because the idea of breaking down is precisely what separates apparent peace from total crisis. So, in this reading, it's not mandatory that the document says 7 years. It could be another time frame, but the prophetic unfolding would be 7 years. The prophetic time frame would be in the sequence of events, not necessarily in a treaty clause. And I think that helps because sometimes we expect a contract with 7 years clearly stated, and it might not be like that. And if we only expect that, we might miss the real movement of the scenario. It might be, yes, an agreement with a 7-year term might appear, but the point is, the text in this interpretation wouldn't require that as a condition. It would require the format, a broad alliance with many, and a prophetic unfolding of 7 years that then leads to rupture and judgment. So, moving forward, the emphasis remains, the Abraham Accords would be very significant, because they represent an unusual normalization movement and a regional repositioning that caught the world's attention. And we recognize with a certain humility something like, I don't like to establish this as absolute truth. And that's healthy, because prophecy isn't for playing around with, it's not for making baseless pronouncements, and it's not for forcing a fit. But, in my opinion, at this moment, the Abraham Accords are so striking that I think they fit into this idea of a covenant with many for 1 week, as Daniel describes, at least as a strong shadow, as a preview, as a scenario that comes too close to the mold. For me, this verse connects strongly with the Abraham Accords because they are extremely significant. And I will insist on this, not because I want it to be, but because, looking at recent history, it's difficult to find something as broad and symbolic as this. I think it's impossible to ignore this unless something even stronger emerges, something more fitting than this, something that, when it happens, no one will doubt is what it is. Because of everything that has been done so far, alliances involving Israel with the Arab world, with interventions by the United States, England, or any other country, until today, nothing as significant as this has happened. Nothing that has so shaken the playing field and the imaginary of regional peace. We've had other agreements with well-known names, the Oslo Accords, Camp David, and so many others. The history of the Middle East is full of attempts, advances, and setbacks. But the Abraham Accords carry a different weight. They seem like a change of era, a repositioning, an attempt to inaugurate a new chapter. Even the name shows this. Abraham is a profoundly spiritual theme, and the name is not neutral. It carries symbolism, it triggers identity, it draws the attention of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. We know that Abraham is seen as the father of the Jewish people, and within the Arab world, he is recognized as Ibrahim. That is to say, it is a name that transcends traditions and connects with faith, narrative, and origin. And I think it's impossible to talk about Abraham without touching on spirituality, because Abraham is only Abraham because God changed his name. Abraham is only Abraham in the land of Canaan because God led him there. So when a political agreement uses this name, it inevitably touches on a religious layer, a symbolic layer, a spiritual layer. So in a way, this subject is already imbued with religiosity and spiritual significance. Therefore, until now, I haven't seen anything as powerful involving peace agreements and alliances between nations as the Abraham Accords. And that's why they enter this prophetic conversation so easily, because of their scope, their impact, their symbolism, and their regional repositioning. And taking advantage of this moment, we are also here together, following something important. And I like to remember this because it's not just information, it's reflection. I think our video today has very interesting topics, so I kindly ask, if it makes sense to you, let's leave a like. This isn't just a channel request, it's a tool for YouTube to understand that the topic matters and deliver it to more people. This helps a lot because it's a response to YouTube itself and makes the content reach other people. And I truly appreciate us being here, investing time, listening, reflecting, and sharing. Because when a message is serious, it deserves to reach more people. Now, continuing our reasoning. Besides the Abraham Accords, what other sign do we need to observe to say that the Great Tribulation has begun? Because if the first axis is covenant with many, the second axis needs to be equally clear, equally biblical. Here the text invites us to go to Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians in chapter 2. And this chapter is one of the most cited when the subject is signs of the end, deception, manifestation of the man of sin. In this chapter, we recall reading verses 1 through 5, where he speaks about our reunion with the Lord. That is, he is speaking directly about Christian hope, about the Lord's return, and about what precedes this event. And in verse 3 he says something more or less like this: "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed." So notice, Paul is not saying any crisis is the end. He is giving milestones: apostasy, manifestation, deception, and the sequence of events. In other words, the man of sin needs to manifest himself, who within this logic would be the one who makes the deals, right? He would be the character who doesn't appear merely as just another politician, but as someone who centralizes the scene, who becomes a global figure of reference, capable of influencing nations and directing history. And Paul describes him. He opposes, he rises up against everything that is called God or is an object of worship. That is, he is not spiritually neutral. He doesn't just come with political pragmatism. He comes with a confrontational, affronting posture, replacing what is holy with something false, to the point of sitting in the temple of God, wanting to appear as God. Notice how powerful this is. It's not just rejecting God, it's trying to occupy God's place. It's the pinnacle of spiritual arrogance, the ultimate idolatry. And when we look calmly, we realize that it's not just a leader on the world stage making deals, because if it were only about deals, it would be diplomacy. But Paul is saying that there is a component of worship, of adoration, of exaltation. There is also the issue of the temple of God. Paul is saying that this figure will sit in the temple of God, as if he were God, seeking exaltation and adoration. So by reading the text, the subject doesn't end in geopolitics. It enters into worship, religious deception, and the substitution of the true for the false. So we ask ourselves, where would this temple be? Where is there a place, a symbol, a religious center that makes sense for this prophecy? In Jerusalem, where the temple once stood, and where, according to this expectation, it should be rebuilt. That is to say, it is not a generic temple anywhere in the world. The historical and prophetic reference points to Jerusalem. But today there is no temple there. What exists is the mosque, and that's where enormous tension arises, because Jerusalem is a highly sensitive point. It is a place of conflict and dispute, not only of territory, but of religious significance. So, for this passage to be fulfilled, this reading concludes that it would be necessary for a temple to be rebuilt. A third temple, as many call it, so that there is literally a temple of God where this figure can sit. And this is pointed to as a sign as strong as the agreements, because it is a visible, historical, concrete sign. If there is no temple, there would be no way to affirm that we have in fact entered the Great Tribulation. It would be like missing an essential piece of the puzzle. Until that happens, the discourse says that we remain on the edge, seeing signs that precede it, but without being able to definitively say, now it has begun. In other words, there is an approach, there is preparation, there are previews, but there is still no absolute landmark that eliminates doubts. Even if there are dreams of trumpets around the world, astronomical signs, geopolitical tensions, and a peace almost taking hold, even if the spiritual atmosphere seems heavy and people feel in their hearts that something is different, the main events that would unequivocally mark now it's really happening would still be missing. And here the text wants to be meticulous. Feeling is not enough. There needs to be fulfillment of milestones. And within this argument, one of these key points is precisely the temple, where he would like to present himself as God. Because the temple is the ultimate symbolic stage, there he not only governs, he demands worship. We've already talked about the third temple. We've already created a timeline, shown why this subject is so relevant to prophecy, and why so many eyes are on Jerusalem. We've given so many details about the reconstruction, shown that the utensils are ready, that there are priests being trained for the temple services, and all of this is presented as preparation. It's not the temple being finished, but the behind-the-scenes work being organized. And even though today there are people saying, no, this is an isolated event, the government isn't involved, I understand that kind of thinking. I really do. Because, in fact, one thing is a religious movement, another thing is a national and political decision. In fact, it's not yet official. But if I'm not mistaken, There's a spiritual movement working behind the scenes, through this body, this institution called Machon Beit Hamikdash, the Temple Institute, to ensure everything is ready according to Halacha and the Torah. In other words, the concern there is to do things the right way within the religious and ritual requirements, so that when there's a political opening, nothing is lacking. The idea is, when there's national political interest, everything is already prepared for reconstruction, as if the spiritual and ritual infrastructure were being set up in advance, and this is being fueled by practical actions, including sacrifices made as a form of training, according to this narrative. Training, preparation, rehearsal, not just theory but ritual practice, like someone preparing for a real retaking. So I'm not going to go into all those details here because we've already covered that in other videos, and I don't want to repeat everything and bore you. But I want you to retain the essence. We also talked about the para aduma, the red heifer, and we addressed that subject quite a bit. But what's important for us to remember is this. Yes, within this interpretation, there needs to be a third temple for this prophecy to be fulfilled, not because we want it to happen, but because the text demands a scenario that is not yet complete today. This is necessary for this political leader, the Antichrist, to want to be worshipped as God, and even to place his image in God's temple. In other words, he not only sits there, he marks his place, he dominates, he occupies, he demands. For this to happen, a standing temple needs to exist. There needs to be a physical place that fulfills Paul's reference. And this is another great sign, capable of indicating that we have entered the period of Great Tribulation. Because when agreement and temple come together, covenant with many and manifestation of the man of sin, the reading understands that the line has been crossed. Now, I want to look at a passage that the text strongly emphasizes, especially verse 9. Because here Paul isn't just talking about politics, he's talking about spiritual power operating behind the scenes. He says in essence that the coming of this character happens according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Notice how weighty this is: power, signs, and lying wonders. That is to say, he comes with credentials. He comes with demonstration. He comes with impact. He comes with something that seems supernatural, but is false. And the text continues speaking of deception, of injustice, of people who perish because they did not receive the love of truth to be saved. This is weighty because it is not just lack of information, it is rejection of truth. It also says that God sends the operation of error so that they believe the lie as a judgment upon those who chose the lie, as a spiritual consequence of the heart that rejects the light. And that those who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in iniquity will be judged. Notice it is not just sinned, it is took pleasure. It is loving what is wrong. And it ends with an exhortation to remain firm, retaining the traditions taught, and a prayer asking for comfort and confirmation in every good word and deed. In other words, the biblical response to deception is not fear. It is firmness, holy tradition, word, and practice. And here's the point that really bothers me: power, signs, and lying wonders. This is presented as something we are experiencing in these last days, as if the world were entering an era where falsehood becomes too sophisticated, too convincing, too seductive. There is a terrible deception happening in the world, and it's not simple, it's not crude, it's refined. And it's not just because of artificial intelligence, although it appears as a strong example. We are reaching a level where sometimes it becomes difficult to distinguish what is true from what is false. And this is not theory, it's daily reality. Increasingly realistic videos, sounds, images, manipulated scenes, as if it were possible to manipulate sight, hearing, the senses. And if deception can capture the senses, it can capture the mind. And when it captures the mind, it begins to capture the heart and faith. This is the time we are living in now, a time when reality seems to be stretched, tested, reshaped, and where many people no longer know what to trust. And we can't ignore this, because ignoring it doesn't protect us. Ignoring it only leaves us vulnerable. At the same time, I think it's beautiful to acknowledge one thing. This technology can also serve the kingdom of God, because God has always used human means to spread the word. Letters, scrolls, printing presses, radio, television, the internet, and now we have even stronger tools. We can use all of this to spread the word, to teach, to transmit, to improve what we are doing, like in this video you are watching. We can reach people in places where we would never physically set foot. We can translate, explain, illustrate, make disciples, encourage hearts. But we also know that this same instrument, which can be used for blessing, can also be used for deception. And that's where the danger lies. The instrument is neither holy nor profane in itself. It becomes what the heart of the user decides to make of it. And that's where the text makes sense. If this leader comes according to the working of Satan, with power, deceit, and lies, then the deception, to be true deception, needs to appear true. Because a weak lie doesn't deceive multitudes. A poorly crafted lie doesn't win devotion. True deception needs to be convincing, needs to be seductive, needs to be perfect in human eyes. False wonders look like miracles, have the appearance of reality, the taste of something real, and that's precisely what makes it all so dangerous. Because the false, when it seems true, doesn't come with a label saying, "I am false." It comes with shine, it comes with authority, it comes with emotion, it comes with a sign, it comes with results. And the passage insists, those who don't want to hear the truth are gradually deceived, more and more misled, because they haven't received the love of truth to save themselves. And notice the expression, it's not just about knowing the truth, it's about loving the truth. Because there are people who even hear the truth but don't love it, and because they don't love it, they exchange the truth for comfort. They exchange the truth for convenience. They exchange the truth for pleasure. Regarding the operation of error, the text itself admits that there are different interpretations, and it's good to acknowledge this with humility, because some things are more straightforward, others are more debated. One of them points to the mark of the beast, but also to everything that comes before, a preparation of the political, geopolitical, and economic scenario, global health issues, and other structures that push people to believe in a lie. As if the world were being conditioned step by step to accept the unacceptable, to normalize the absurd, to obey without questioning, to call a lie a solution. And what would be the purpose of all this? That those who did not believe in the truth and took pleasure in iniquity be judged. In other words, it's not just falling into deception due to a lack of light, it's choosing deception because it aligns with the desires of the heart. So within this interpretation, we are living in a time of illusions, a time when the glitter of falsehood tries to pass itself off as real, a time when things seem holy but are not, seem good but are not, seem good but are not. And here comes a very strong warning. If we don't have the Spirit of God, that we won't be able to clearly discern what is right and what is wrong. Because discernment is not just intelligence, discernment is light. And light, biblically, comes from God. I think that's the weight of the message. Spiritual discernment today is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's not optional. It's not for those who are very spiritual. It's for spiritual survival in this time. Remember the spiritual gifts that Paul teaches us about. Seek the gift of discerning spirits. This is very serious because he doesn't say if you want to, he instructs you to seek it. Those who do not have the Spirit of God cannot discern spirits, brothers and sisters, because spiritual things are discerned spiritually. Therefore it is necessary to seek the Spirit of God and seek this spiritual gift of discernment, because the time we are living in is a time of deception, a time of illusion. And where there is illusion, there is much noise, many voices, much falsehood mixed with a little truth. And this is confusing. And the truth is that we can only see what is in front of us and also what is behind the curtain if we have the Spirit of God. Because without the Spirit, we only see the stage. With the Spirit, we begin to perceive what's behind the scenes. Without the Spirit, we only see the effect. With the Spirit, we perceive the intention. Now, continuing in the letter, he says something like, "So that through our gospel, our good news, he called you to attain the glory of our Lord Yeshua, the Messiah." In other words, God's call is not for fear, it is for glory. It is not for perdition, it is for redemption. That is God's purpose for us. It is our redemption. We were called to attain glory, to attain the world to come. And this is an anchor. When the world trembles, we remember that our destiny is not chaos, it is glory. And this affects me, because we weren't called to be trapped here and perish in this world. We weren't called to live as slaves to the flesh, to sin, and to the system. We will only perish if we want to, if we persist in error, if we don't abandon sin, if we continue in the practice that we know destroys us. Because sin isn't just a slip. Sin is a path that, when not abandoned, destroys the person inside and out. Of course, this message isn't for everyone. It's for some who need this warning. But those who need it need to listen seriously. But if there isn't a real abandonment of sin, the person is lost. And this isn't a threat, it's a spiritual consequence. That's why God gives us opportunities to listen, to awaken, and to change. Because God is patient, God calls, God corrects, God warns, God extends a hand to change behavior, to change direction, to truly repent. I think this is a very strong call for us to wake up in these last days. Because waking up here doesn't mean being anxious, it means being conscious and obedient. And if God weren't interested in us, He wouldn't say anything more. He would let us continue on our path without warning, without correction, without a voice. But if we are hearing this today, it's because God wants us to wake up. It's because there's still time to align, to adjust, to return to the path. He called us not to perish, but to glory, to the world to come. And that is hope, but it is also responsibility. In verse 15, he says, "Therefore, brothers, stand firm." And this phrase needs to resonate within us. He is speaking to you and to me. We need to stand firm. Firm not in pride, but in faith. Firm not in religiosity, but in obedience. And how do we stand firm? By seeking God, studying the Word, knowing God through the Scriptures. Because faith without the Word becomes sensation, and sensation passes. The Word remains. I reinforce this invitation for us to immerse ourselves in this. Daily reading, meditation, life with God, communion. Because this is what sustains the heart when the world becomes confusion. When confusion grows outside, the Word needs to grow inside. And Paul continues, "Stand firm and hold fast to the traditions." And here I think it's important for us to consider, what traditions is Paul talking about? Because we can read this with a modern lens and be wrong. Did organized Christianity as we know it today already exist? Did the Roman Catholic Church already exist? Did Baptists, Assemblies of God, Pentecostals, and so many other denominations already exist? No. So, what traditions is he talking about? He is talking about something earlier, older, more rooted in the Scriptures and in the life of God's people. Within this line of understanding, he is speaking of the good traditions of Israel, taught by the disciples of the Master Yeshua, our Messiah. Traditions in the sense of holy practices, rhythms of life, principles, commandments lived, spiritual memory, traditions such as keeping the Sabbath, observing the feasts of Adonai, living properly, fearing God, keeping His commandments. That is to say, a life ordained by God, not guided by spiritual fads. And here I think it is fair for us to make a humble clarification. It is not about forcibly Judaizing anyone, nor creating a meaningless burden. It is about looking at what is good, holy, and aligned with the Scriptures. It is about recovering roots, not imposing burdens. It is about seeking holiness, not appearance. Furthermore, above tradition, there is commandment. Commandment is not human custom. Commandment is divine direction. And that changes everything, because human tradition can vary. God's commandment is eternal. He also says, "which you were taught, either by word of mouth or by our letter." That is to say, living teaching and written teaching, oral and written, practice and doctrine. And then comes this beautiful prayer, that the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, and God our Father, who loved us and by grace gave us eternal comfort and good hope, may comfort our hearts and strengthen us in every good word and deed. And this is wonderful, because He not only warns, He also comforts. He not only exhorts, He also strengthens. And this calls us to action, because true faith has never been a static faith. Faith in the kingdom always produces movement. Good word and good deed means that we need to be involved in the work, truly involved, not just in theory, not just in discourse, but in daily practice, serving, helping, teaching, living the word, and producing fruit. We can't stand still, doing nothing. We can't live as spiritual spectators, watching the world crumble and thinking that life with God is just feeling. The Lord's coming needs to find us working with clean hands, with aligned hearts, with a peaceful conscience, with faithfulness. And if our portion is to die and attain resurrection, so be it. Because dying in Christ is not defeat, it is rest and hope. But if not, we hope that He will find us standing, obeying, living what He taught us. Standing means firm. It means not compromising truth. It means not selling holiness for convenience. This resonates with the passages from Revelation that were cited. Those who keep God's commandments and have faith in Yeshua. Those who keep God's commandments and bear witness to Yeshua. In other words, it's not just saying you believe, it's keeping them. It's not just talking about Jesus, it's living in such a way that the testimony remains. And in this view, this is our generation. We are trying to teach people to keep the commandments and maintain the testimony. Because in times of deception, what sustains is not enthusiasm, it's faithfulness. And faithfulness has a form, commandments and testimony. So in these latter times, it is important that we remain vigilant, with our spiritual vision wide awake to the scenario of the last days. Vigilant not to live in panic, but to live in discernment. Vigilant not to feed paranoia, but to nurture holiness, vigilance and preparedness. Because Satan knows that the more he deceives and misleads, the more he distances people from God and from the divine purpose. He doesn't need to destroy a person all at once. It is enough to gradually divert them, gradually cool them down, gradually confuse them, until the person is lost along the way. But the Spirit of God also awakens us more and more, and this is the wonderful aspect. God does not leave His people voiceless, without direction, without warning, as in the letters of Revelation. He who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That is to say, there is an active voice of the Spirit calling, correcting, awakening, bringing life, bringing direction. In other words, the Spirit of the eternal God is speaking to us and calling us to awaken. And awakening here means returning to our first love, aligning our hearts, adjusting our course, stopping our playful nature with sin, and taking God seriously. And it is important that we listen to God's voice in these last days, because whoever does not listen to God's voice will inevitably hear another voice, and that is dangerous. And to conclude this topic, within this line of interpretation, we are not yet in the Great Tribulation. And it is important to say this responsibly, without sensationalism and without forcing a fit. The greatest signs have not yet been fully fulfilled, such as a full peace agreement between Arab nations and Israel, associated with the Abraham Accords, and there is also no temple standing. In other words, there are still fundamental pieces out of place, but at the same time, the discourse says that we are already on the verge, as if we were at the doors, for it to happen. As if the stage were being set, as if the preparation were advancing, as if the world were entering a phase of acceleration. Comment: I'm ready for the rapture if you've watched this far. I want to know, are you really ready? Are you seeking God? Are you watching? Improve your knowledge by watching other videos on our channel. God bless you, and see you later. Stay in peace, remain steadfast, and don't let your heart be distracted by the allure of falsehood.